This is the Rebel HR Podcast, the podcast about all things innovation in the people space. I'm Kyle Rode. Let's start the show. Welcome back, Rebel community. This is going to be a fun conversation today. With us, we have Kelly Campbell. They are the author of the new book, available now where books are sold, Heal to Lead, Revolutionizing Leadership Through Trauma Healing. Welcome to the show, Kelly.
Thanks, Kyle. It's great to be here.
Well, I am really, really excited to have you here. And this is a topic that we haven't really dug into on the podcast much. We've talked about, mental health in general. We've talked about things like psychological safety and making the workplace, a secure place to work. But this is going to be a little bit of a new topic. So thanks for joining us and excited to dig into it today.
Yeah, same here.
Well, really excited to talk about it. I know how challenging writing a book can be, and this is no small undertaking. So I'm always curious to ask an author, what motivated you to spend the time and energy to write this book, Heal to Lead?
Well, I'll be honest with you that it's been about 5 years in the making because I started writing my third book before I started writing my first book, as a lot of people do. And then I got some great advice, and someone told me that and really said, I need to hear your voice. As a first book, we need to hear your voice, your point of view, and, really leaning into your lived experience, your expertise, all of it. And so when and it wasn't a huge departure from the first book that I was writing, but my voice is so focal and so present in this one, where it really was like 1/8 of the situation earlier. Why I wanted to tackle this particular subject, and that is the correlation between childhood trauma and leadership style, is literally because no one else has talked about this in a direct manner. Like you said, we talk about mental health, we talk about all of these different things. Yes, we bring in psychological safety. So we're starting to sort of, lean into it in certain ways, but we're still distanced from the word trauma, from the idea of healing, particularly in workplace environments, and forget about talking about leaders and the trauma that they may have experienced, which may explain why they're showing up the way that they're showing up. So it felt like the time is really, really now for this conversation.
Yeah, that's a really interesting call out. And I think, the term you used, I think, was dancing around, this topic. And the reality is it's kind of like we've corporatized trauma a little bit, right? Like we've packaged it into something that's mildly comfortable for some within the world of work. But the reality is, I think there's still a lot of kind of hesitation to really be open around the topic of trauma, and a little bit of I would say fear to actually open up honestly. And give our employees the opportunity to open up, kind of in a really, maybe emotional way in the workplace. And so one of the things that we want to talk about, a little bit today, we were talking before I hit record, as it relates to an HR professional or a people leader in the workplace, is something that you call compassionate intelligence. And so. Let's start the conversation there. What is the concept of compassionate intelligence, and how do you find that applicable in the world of work today?
So let me back up a little bit and tell you about the 4 fundamentals of high conscious leadership, because compassionate intelligence sits sort of as a subset under one of those. So in the book, I talk about these 4 fundamentals. The first one, in my opinion, being the most important, because it's the way that we develop self-awareness, which is really trauma integration. Integrating our emotional wounds, our psychological wounds from when we were younger, our formative years, obviously lays the groundwork for us to become really healthy leaders, really self-aware, comfortable with vulnerability, which is the second fundamental, right? Embodying, actually, not just comfortable with vulnerability, but really embodying it, having it be part of our way of being. so that vulnerability doesn't feel like, an awkward share. It becomes part of the way that we operate and the way that we speak and the way that we interact with others. And the third fundamental is leading with compassion. I specifically did not say leading with empathy. And the reason for that is because empathy, while it is wonderful and it's a great quality that many leaders, many effective leaders have, empathy is really about feeling with someone else, right? Compassion takes that a step further. And essentially it's feeling with and then taking supportive action on behalf of. And then the fourth fundamental is lighting the way for others. So that's the framework. And then if we go to this third fundamental, leading with compassion, the number one question that I'm going to get from leaders, from HR professionals, from people operations is really, well, how do I know that I'm not leaning too far in from a supportive perspective, right? Like what is that line? Because there is a line. And so this basic framework for what I'm calling compassionate intelligence, which is, yes, have compassion, but be smart about it, right? Be rational about it. There's essentially three different questions that I say sort of come into play and how HR and people leaders can think about this. What does the employee need is question number one. What do I need as their supervisor or their director or their HR professional or their leader? And then what does the business or what does the organization need if it's not a business, right? So this framework of what do they need? What do I need? What does the organization needs essentially looks at the holistic picture of what are the needs? What are we talking about here? And then we can start to understand how we might support the employee in a really intelligent way that gives everyone maybe not 100% of what they need, right? Because you're not going to be able to meet the needs of the employee, yourself, and the business in all contexts. We know that. It's not realistic. But at least it gives us a little bit of a starting point to have that discussion. So that's kind of what I mean by compassionate intelligence.
Yeah, I think it's really important to really get specific about the role that we play in that. And I think you mentioned there is a line, and I think a lot of times people in kind of the humanistic professions within an organization, they usually get into those jobs because they care about people, right? And so like when somebody is showing up with challenges or in an emotional state, or there's trauma that needs to be responded to with compassion, it's like an either or. It's almost like a binary, like, well, no, that's outside of work, so don't emotionally dump your problems at work, bottle it up, which is honestly kind of the way we were coached, a decade or more ago. And then you've got the other end where it's almost like, HR or the manager becomes like a counselor, right? And it's like everything kind of comes out, and it's good intentions, but may or may not be what that person actually needs in that moment. So how do we distinguish between that, like being that open, like psychologically safe space, but also making sure that we're not going too far or crossing some sort of a boundary as we're trying to be supportive?
Yeah. And I love the fact that you just said boundaries, because that's where I'm going with this, is like, we really need to be solid within ourselves, and we need to have really healthy boundaries as people in these kinds of positions. Because if our boundaries are squishy or muddy, that's going to be confusing to the employee, right? And so the clearer we are on what our role is, what support we're able to provide to them, how we consciously communicate to the employee so that, yes, we're creating that rapport and we're letting them know that we care about them, but we're not promising things that we really shouldn't be, promising, and things that we quite honestly just cannot deliver. One of the examples that I give in the book is that, let's say there's a leader, HR leader, and someone on the team is dealing with addiction. And that becomes something that, is talked about in an HR meeting. Obviously confidential, obviously private. The HR leader is not going to say, okay, well, you're dealing with addiction. We really want to support you. I'm going to dip into my child's college fund in order to get you into an inpatient program, right? You're not going to do that, right? And I use that as an extreme case because I want to highlight sometimes we try to make promises, or we try to advocate to get the best possible thing for the employee, and it's just not within our toolbox. So instead, what you might do is, again, depending upon the organization and what kind of benefits you have, you might help them by looking into what is available to them, and then what it looks like from an FMLA standpoint or medical leave or what have you. So you're giving them support. You're letting them know that you care, that you're really hearing them, that the issue that they're dealing with is definitely something that you are taking to heart. You are there in their corner to support them and within the parameters of what you can do. And sometimes that it's not going to be enough according to the employee, right? And sometimes you're going to feel kind of handcuffed because from a bureaucratic standpoint, you don't have the ability to do what you really think is right. Right. So we are in this kind of dance. We'll go back to that, where we want to do the right thing. We don't always have the tools to be able to do it. And I mean tools, not necessarily personally, but from the organization. Right. So it's really about getting clear on what all of those things are.
We'll be back after a quick break.
Have you ever heard a new digital trend and thought to yourself, okay, does this really matter? Asking the right questions helps you cut through the noise and get down to what matters most. I'm Jim Hertzfeld, host of the What If, So What podcast, where we discover what's possible with digital and figure out how to make it real by asking what if, so what, and most importantly, now what? Subscribe and listen, and together we can turn big ideas into tangible actions so you can get shit done.
Yeah, I think that's really powerful. And as a recovering people pleaser, that boundaries word can be pretty, challenging, right? And I think there's a lot of us in this profession that, we want to help, right? And if somebody does present to us with some level of trauma, we want to be helpful. But there is a healthy boundary. And I think one of the other things, from a personal standpoint, and as I've worked with other professionals, is a lot of times you'll also find people in these roles that struggle with boundaries because they haven't dealt with their own stuff, right? And
100%.
Yeah. So it's like you're trying to fix someone else, but you really need to put your own oxygen mask on first. So as we think about that, I'm fascinated to understand. You mentioned in the beginning of this conversation that that trauma, that childhood trauma, informs how you lead. And so what are some of the like some of the correlations between some of the childhood trauma and how that actually presents itself in leadership style?
Yeah. So people pleasers are on a spectrum between people pleasing and people controlling, right? I say a spectrum because it's not an either or. This isn't a binary. You're not one or the other. You can be both in the same day, and you can slide across that spectrum within the same week. That's reality, right? Most people in the humanistic professions that you're talking about do tend to slide a little bit closer to that people-pleasing end of the spectrum. My hand is raised as well. And really what that is we didn't necessarily feel, and this is a very blanket statement, so I'm using that as my disclaimer, very blanket statement. We didn't necessarily feel that just for who we were when we were younger, that we would be accepted or loved or feel a sense of belonging. So what we tried to do is we tried to create the conditions in which we would receive those things. We would get those needs met, right? It's a beautiful design. It's a beautiful survival strategy. Mm-hmm. So that looks like trying to get straight A's when you're a kid, maybe excelling in arts or athletics or something like that, trying to please whoever your caregivers are so that they will notice you, provide attention, maybe affirm your and validate your sense of self and your, existence in many cases. Sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't, given who the caregivers were. But that sets the foundation for who we are. And that, quite honestly, we're talking about HR professionals and people leaders. That sets the foundation for the professions many times that we go into, because we do want to help people. Why do we want to do that? Because we don't want, in adulthood, and this is subconscious, we don't want other people to feel the same way that we felt when we were younger. And if that's sort of a light bulb moment for you as you're listening, I get it, right? Maybe you've never thought about why you chose the profession that you did. The way that I thought about this was, and kind of came to this myself, was when I was 22, I started a business. I started a cause marketing agency where we did digital marketing for nonprofits and foundations and social impact initiatives. Do-gooder stuff. It had me written all over it, right? And I loved that we got to do that work. It was really impactful. I felt good about it. I loved my team, all the things. But fast forward 14 years later, and when I sold the company, because I was really, really unhappy and burnt out and all the things at a very young age, I started thinking about and questioning, why did I actually create a company at 22 years old? That's kind of a strange thing to do. It's not a thing that most people do. And really where I landed was I wanted to recreate the environment in which I was needed and valued and that I mattered, right? So because I didn't feel like that when I was younger at the hands of my mother, I created or recreated an environment in which my employees and my clients really needed me, really valued me, and I mattered to all of them because I was either, responsible for their paycheck or I was responsible for the success of their marketing there. So if you haven't ever thought about why you're drawn to the profession that you're drawn to, there is some answer in this. Again, I say at the beginning, it was a blanket statement because I don't know what happened to each and every person who's listening. But generally speaking, when we're talking about trauma-based leadership styles and that spectrum of people pleasing and people controlling, it is rooted in something that sounds like that.
Oh, interesting. I'm gonna see how many emails I get after people listening to me. Like,
I'm sorry,
get out of my head, Kelly.
I'm sorry, and you're welcome.
That's one of those things. It's like once you learn it, it's like, oh, now I can't unlearn this. It's like, oh, great, yeah. But I mean, I think, I do think that there's so much truth in the kind of that subconscious drive to like help people and the question why,
Yeah.
And I think it's really interesting. I also, would venture to guess that many people in in this type of a profession also maybe prefer to focus on on helping helping others versus helping themselves, and that's certainly my personal experience. And I think until you really start to get honest with yourself and do some of the really, really unfun work, it can just kind of sit there. And
unfun, but really, really rewarding.
Right. Right.
Yeah. But what you're speaking to is really, we've been talking about sort of the positives of people pleasing, which is like wanting to help people, which is a really beautiful thing. And some of the pitfalls of that are we don't want to be a burden on others, right? So what we tend to do, and this is why it leads to burnout and overwhelm so often, especially in HR, is we take on more than what we can actually handle. We say we're fine. We don't speak up. We don't advocate for ourselves. We end up burning out or feeling that overwhelm, right? Which clearly is not sustainable. We get sick, so it manifests as sickness. Hopefully that's just temporary, but in some cases that manifests as more chronic illness. We know that from the work of Dr. Gabor Mate. We know that from Bessel van der Kolk's work that, the body really does keep the score. That's the title of his book. And so trauma lives in our body. And if we don't do anything about it to really integrate it and reincorporate it, then we're just playing out that same scenario over and over again. And it really will manifest in these really maladaptive ways. How that impacts us, that's more on the human side, right? But how that impacts us in terms of leadership style is the people that we work with, our colleagues, now see us as unreliable because we take on so much. And of course, things are going to slip through the cracks. It's just the nature of it because we're taking on more than what we actually have capacity for. The intention is good, but the execution is what suffers. And, these are all of so when we talk about people pleasing as a leadership style or as that spectrum of leadership style, there are so many legs, as you can start to see, to all of this and how the tentacles really go into so many places for ourselves, for our own health, for our own mental well-being, also for our relationships with our colleagues. We also bring this home at night to our partners and our children, and on and on and on. So the ripple effect is really, really significant.
Yeah. I do think to use a personal anecdote, there was a point in my career where, I kind of intentionally said yes to almost every opportunity. And, and there was an abundance of opportunities to get involved in, in wonderful nonprofits and in projects and, and all these teams at work. And it did manifest itself into a place where, I had to actually draw boundaries on things that I had previously said yes to. And ultimately, I had to let some people down. There were some commitments that were made in the midst of the excitement and optimism that were just unrealistic based upon the demands of life and complete lack of balance. Right. And for me, that manifested in a number of not so awesome things. But did prompt me to actually start to ask the question why and start to do that work. Like, okay, why am I driven to do this? And why am I not showing up for myself? And so for those of us that are listening to this and kind of feel like, okay, I feel like I'm being seen or feel like this is really applicable. Where should we begin if we're starting to think about some of these past emotional wounds and try to understand how to kind of move forward with a more effective way of leading by resolving some of these traumas? Yeah.
So I want to start by saying I don't use the word healed, ED, past tense. It's a lifelong commitment. So let's start there, and then you can gauge your willingness. That's how I'll say it. But really, if you've not, most people in HR are comfortable at least talking to a therapist because many times they are almost acting the part of one. If you are currently in therapy, great. There can be many, many other modalities that are more somatic in nature so that you're actually moving trauma out of the body. You're approaching it in very different ways, very unique ways that you may not have heard about. So part of the supplement to the book is an online resource called myhealingmenu.com, literally set up like a restaurant menu. So you can kind of explore through there. Nothing is recommended. It's really just an educational resource. And, if you have not spoken to anyone before, then obviously talk therapy is a great entry. I kind of jokingly call it the gateway drug. But it's not the thing that is going to help you reincorporate or integrate that trauma, release that trauma out of your body, because talk therapy by its very nature is cerebral, right? You're talking about, someone just said this to me the other day. Think about the difference between therapy and coaching, right? If you draw a line in the middle of a horizontal line, from the line that you are vertically in the middle backwards, that's therapy. From the line forward, that's probably coaching or HR or mentorship, et cetera, right? Because we're talking about what's happened in the past in therapy. You're unpacking all of the things that, have happened to you, which is not trauma, by the way. Trauma are not, that's not the events that have happened to you. It's actually your association with those events, right? It's what happens inside of you because of the events that have happened to you or that you've been part of. Going forward is really more the coaching and HR and all of that. So I think always talking is a great starting point. It's just not going to be the thing that, is the quick fix by any means. It's not going to be the be all end all. So more of these somatic experiences. And again, there are hundreds on that website. I always recommend just browse it. Keep your eyes and ears open to other modalities that people are talking about. If you're curious about them, research them a little bit more, try them out. And the only caveat with that is on myhealingmenu.com, I talk about the dessert section of the menu as plant medicine and psychedelics. And so the only caveat there is that that's not for everyone, obviously. And that's really not for you if you are already aware of a mental health condition or you're on medications like SSRIs, because that would be contraindicated.
Yeah, I think, so this is, on a personal level. So, I was one of those that full-blown people pleaser, humanistic occupation, said yes to everything. And, when people would ask me, I'd be like, yeah, I had a perfect childhood. Well, that's always a big red flag, right? So it wasn't until recently that I actually started, I did the gateway drug, I did the talk therapy, and then started to really, really focus on some of that, kind of that continuous work. And yes, it absolutely is a journey. But I think, for those that are listening to this and are kind of realizing that, hey, maybe there is an opportunity to look at this for myself, take the opportunity to get educated, right? Because there is a lot out there, and it's at some points like really overwhelming. So I think the fact that you put this into like a menu format is kind of genius, so that you can actually kind of think about processing in a way that makes sense and that you're comfortable with, and I think could be really powerful. So I would echo that. If you're not thinking about that or don't have some resources to help you through some of these things, then get educated. So.
Yeah. And I'm glad that you said it like that. And, ultimately what this comes down to, and I think you've kind of alluded to this in some of the personal examples, is getting clear on what you will and will not accept, getting comfortable with the fact that you will, in having boundaries or better boundaries at all, you will let people down. And as a chronic people pleaser, that's going to be hard, right? That's the worst thing in the world to a people pleaser, is to let someone down, to disappoint another person, to say no. Oh my God. Right. And, the reality though is you can't keep pouring from that empty cup. So at some point, maybe commitments that you've already made, you can pull back on. You'll have better information, more information to know that, saying yes to every single thing is not actually in your best interest. As much as you want to help, it doesn't make you a bad person. I think there are people that need to hear this. It doesn't make you a bad person when you say no to a request. You can have a filtering system similar to what I talked about with compassion and intelligence, a filtering system to say, is this something that, there's a request that comes in, whether it's work, whether it's from a family commitment, or obligation in many cases, a friend group, whatever it is, there's a request, right? Like, hey, can you come do this thing? Can you help with this? Our natural posture is to immediately by default say yes, of course. But if we apply a filter, to those requests and start to say, like, do I actually have time? Do I want to do this? Is this going to bring me joy? Has this person asked like several times for other things? And, really at the end of the day, like, is this an act of self-love for me to say yes to this? Or would it be detrimental to me in any way? That doesn't make you selfish, right? That gives you the opportunity to really fill your own cup so that when you do serve other people, you do help other people, you're doing it from a place of presence. You're doing it really with a lot of intention and a lot of integrity. Otherwise, you're giving everyone pieces of yourself, right? You're not giving anyone the full you.
Yeah. Well, powerful note, and I think really, really important for us to think about in human resources and people leadership. So we will leave it there. With that, we are at the end of our time together, and I want to be respectful, but I want to give a warm handoff to our listeners. Where can they learn more about you, find the book, and continue to understand some of this important work?
Yeah, so my website is klcampbell.com. And the book is on there. My work is on there. Obviously, the book is available Amazon, Barnes & Noble, lots and lots of other places, independent bookstores, etc. But all the information that you need is right on that website.
And we will have a link to that in the show notes. So pop open your podcast players, check it out, and get your hands on the book. Kelly, thank you so much for spending some time with us. Really, really critical topic that we don't talk about enough. So thank you for putting this out there and for having this conversation with us today.
Yeah, thanks for diving in. Thanks for being, vulnerable and sharing some of the things that you did as well.
Thank you. All right, that does it for the Rebel HR podcast. Big thank you to our guests. Follow us on Facebook at Rebel HR Podcast, Twitter at Rebel HR Guy, or see our website at rebelhumanresources.com. The views and opinions expressed by Rebel HR Podcast are those of the authors and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of any of the organizations that we represent. No animals were harmed during the filming of this podcast.
Baby.